The Innocent Child. Chapter 1. The Accusation. Ethan Michaels had never considered himself a hero, let alone a criminal. He was just an ordinary lawyer working in the sleepy town of Clearwater, Mississippi, handling small cases that rarely made it to court. His days were spent drafting wills, negotiating property disputes, and occasionally defending a DUI. But everything changed the day he took on the case of 8-year-old Emma Collins. Emma was the kind of child who could melt even the hardest heart. With her big brown eyes and innocent smile, she was a favorite among the townspeople. Her parents, Sarah and David Collins, were well-respected members of the community. Sarah, a schoolteacher, and David, a mechanic with his own garage. They lived a modest but happy life, far removed from the troubles of the world. That was until the day Emma was accused of something unthinkable, the murder of her classmate, Tommy Reynolds. The news spread through Clearwater like wildfire. Tommy Reynolds, a rambunctious 9-year-old, had been found dead in the woods behind the school, his body bruised and lifeless. The shock was compounded when Emma was found near the scene, her dress stained with blood, clutching a small, bloodied rock. The evidence seemed damning, and the police wasted no time arresting her. Ethan couldn't believe what he was hearing when Sarah Collins showed up at his office, tears streaming down her face. "You have to help us," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "Emma didn't do this. She couldn't have." Ethan hesitated. He was no criminal defense attorney, and the idea of defending a child accused of murder was daunting, to say the least. But one look at Sarah's desperate eyes, and he knew he couldn't turn her away. "I'll do what I can," he assured her, even as a knot of fear tightened in his stomach. The case was unlike anything Ethan had ever encountered. The evidence against Emma was overwhelming. Her fingerprints were on the rock, and there were traces of Tommy's blood on her clothes. Witnesses had seen the two children arguing earlier that day, and Emma had been overheard saying she hated Tommy. It all pointed to a crime of passion, committed in the heat of the moment by a child who didn't understand the consequences of her actions. But something about the case didn't sit right with Ethan. Emma was just a child, sweet, kind, and gentle. The idea of her committing such a brutal act seemed impossible. As he dug deeper, Ethan began to uncover inconsistencies in the police report and gaps in the evidence. There were no other footprints at the scene, and the timeline didn't add up. It was almost as if the case had been put together too quickly, with too much certainty. The more Ethan investigated, the more he became convinced that Emma was being framed. But who would want to frame an innocent child? With the trial date fast approaching, Ethan knew he was running out of time. The prosecution was pushing for a swift conviction, eager to close the case and reassure the terrified town. But Ethan was determined to prove Emma's innocence, no matter what it took. He would have to navigate the murky waters of small-town politics, face down a ruthless prosecutor, and confront the dark secrets that lurked beneath Clearwater's peaceful surface. As he prepared for the battle ahead, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something, a vital piece of the puzzle that could either save or destroy Emma's life. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that the stakes were higher than he had ever imagined. Chapter 2. The Hidden Truth. The courtroom was packed on the first day of the trial, the air thick with anticipation and dread. Reporters from nearby cities had swarmed Clearwater, turning the small town into a media circus. The sight of little Emma Collins, sitting at the defense table with her legs dangling off the chair, was enough to break anyone's heart. She looked so small, so fragile, as if the weight of the world was pressing down on her tiny shoulders. Ethan stood beside her, feeling the eyes of the entire town on him. He was no stranger to the courtroom, but this case felt different, heavier, more consequential. The prosecutor, Leonard Hargrove, was a seasoned veteran with a reputation for being ruthless. He had never lost a case, and he seemed determined to add Emma to his list of convictions. As the trial began, Hargrove wasted no time laying out the prosecution's case. He painted a chilling picture of Emma as a disturbed child with violent tendencies, a ticking time bomb who had finally exploded. The evidence was presented with precision, the bloodied rock, the fingerprints, the eyewitness accounts. Each piece fit together perfectly, forming a damning portrait of guilt. But as Ethan cross-examined the witnesses, he began to unravel the prosecution's narrative. The eyewitnesses were shaky, their stories inconsistent under pressure. One by one, they began to admit that they hadn't actually seen Emma commit the crime, only that they had seen her nearby. The physical evidence, too, started to crumble under scrutiny. The blood on Emma's dress didn't match Tommy's blood type, a fact that had somehow been overlooked in the initial investigation. And then there was the matter of the missing footprints. Ethan had visited the crime scene multiple times, poring over every detail. The ground was soft and muddy, yet there were no footprints other than Emma's. It was as if someone had wiped the area clean, removing any trace of themselves. But why would a child do such a thing? It didn't make sense. As Ethan dug deeper, he discovered something even more troubling: a history of complaints against the police department, accusing them of mishandling evidence and coercing confessions. It was a small town, and the officers were more accustomed to breaking up bar fights than investigating murders. Could it be that they had rushed to judgment, eager to close the case and move on? Ethan's suspicions grew when he uncovered a series of anonymous threats sent to the Collins family in the weeks leading up to Tommy's death. The letters, crudely written, warned them to stay in line and not make trouble. But trouble for whom? And what had they done to deserve such threats? With each revelation, Ethan's resolve hardened. He knew he was up against more than just a murder charge. He was fighting a system that seemed determined to bury the truth. But as he prepared to call his next witness, a twist he hadn't anticipated threatened to derail everything. A new piece of evidence had surfaced, one that could change the course of the trial. A video recording, taken by a security camera at a nearby convenience store, showing a figure running from the direction of the crime scene just moments after Tommy's death. The figure was too distant to identify, but it was clear that it wasn't Emma. The prosecution tried to dismiss the footage as irrelevant, but Ethan knew it was a game changer. It was the first solid proof that someone else had been at the scene, a shadowy figure who might be the real killer. But who was it, and why had they gone unnoticed until now? Ethan's mind raced as he considered his next move. The video was a lifeline, but it also raised more questions than it answered. If Emma hadn't killed Tommy, then who had? And why had they allowed an innocent child to take the fall? The courtroom was silent as Ethan prepared to present the new evidence. He could feel the tension in the air, the weight of expectation from both the defense and the prosecution. This was his chance to turn the tide, to shift the narrative and cast doubt on the prosecution's case. But as he stood to address the jury, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were only scratching the surface of a much deeper conspiracy. One that might be more dangerous than anyone had realized. Chapter 3. The Shadow of Doubt. The video footage sent ripples through the courtroom, casting doubt on everything that had come before. For the first time since the trial began, the jury seemed uncertain, their gazes shifting from Emma to the grainy image on the screen. Ethan felt a surge of hope, but he knew better than to let his guard down. Leonard Hargrove wasn't the type to go down without a fight. Hargrove was quick to strike back. In his closing argument, he dismissed the video as a distraction, a desperate attempt by the defense to cloud the jury's judgment. The defendant's fingerprints were on the weapon, Hargrove thundered, his voice booming through the courtroom. She was found at the scene with the victim's blood on her clothes. This video changes nothing. It's a red herring, plain and simple. Ethan could see the effect of Hargrove's words on the jury. Their initial uncertainty wavered, and some of them began to nod in agreement. But Ethan wasn't finished yet. He had one more card to play, a witness who might hold the key to unraveling the entire case. It was a long shot, but Ethan knew he had to take it. The witness, a middle-aged man named Frank Dobbins, had come forward after seeing news reports about the trial. He was a truck driver who had been passing through Clearwater on the day of Tommy's murder. Frank had been stopping by the convenience store when he saw a young man running from the direction of the school, his clothes disheveled and his face pale. At the time, Frank hadn't thought much of it, assuming the man was just another local in a hurry. But when he saw the video footage on the news, he recognized the figure immediately. "It was him," Frank testified, his voice steady. "The man I saw was the same one in that video. He was running like he'd seen a ghost." Ethan pressed him for details. "Did you see his face? Anything that could help identify him?" Frank shook his head. "No, he kept his head down, like he didn't want to be seen. But I remember his build, tall, skinny, wearing a hoodie. It wasn't much, but it was something. More importantly, it introduced the possibility that someone else had been at the crime scene, someone who had a reason to run." Ethan knew it wasn't enough to secure an acquittal, but it was enough to plant the seed of doubt. After Frank's testimony, Ethan called one final witness, Dr. Marilyn Pierce, a child psychologist who had evaluated Emma after her arrest. Dr. Pierce testified that Emma showed no signs of violent tendencies and that her mental state was consistent with that of a typical child her age. "In my professional opinion, Emma Collins is not capable of the crime she's been accused of," Dr. Pierce concluded. As the trial drew to a close, Ethan delivered his closing argument, urging the jury to consider the possibility that they had been misled. "Emma Collins is an innocent child," he said, his voice firm. "The evidence against her is circumstantial at best, and there are too many unanswered questions. We cannot convict her based on fear and assumption. We must seek the truth." The jury deliberated for hours, their decision hanging in the balance. Ethan could feel the tension in the air as they filed back into the courtroom, their faces unreadable. The judge asked the foreman for the verdict, and time seemed to stand still. "In the case of the state of Mississippi versus Emma Collins, we find the defendant not guilty." Relief washed over Ethan as the words echoed through the courtroom. Sarah Collins burst into tears, hugging her daughter tightly, while David sat in stunned silence. It was over. Emma was free. But as the courtroom erupted in a mix of cheers and gasps, Ethan couldn't shake the nagging feeling that they were still missing something. Emma might be free, but Tommy Reynolds was still dead, and the person responsible was out there, walking free. The shadowy figure from the video, the man Frank Dobbins had seen, was still a mystery. And deep down, Ethan knew that the case was far from over. Chapter 4. A Town's Secret. The victory in court was short-lived. Though Emma was acquitted, the Collins family was far from free. They returned home to find their house vandalized, murder scrawled in red paint across the front door. It was a message from the town. Clearwater wasn't ready to forgive or forget. Despite the verdict, the people of Clearwater were convinced of Emma's guilt. The Collins family became pariahs overnight, shunned by neighbors and former friends. Sarah lost her job at the school, and David's garage was suddenly devoid of customers. Ethan couldn't ignore what was happening. His conscience wouldn't allow him to move on, not when an innocent child's life had been so thoroughly upended. He started digging deeper, looking into the Reynolds family and anyone who might have had a grudge against them or the Collinses. What he found was a web of secrets that stretched back years, implicating some of the town's most respected citizens. At the center of it all was Tommy's father, Alan Reynolds, a man with a dark past. Alan had moved to Clearwater to escape trouble in his old life, but trouble had followed him. Ethan uncovered court records from a different state showing that Alan had been involved in a serious altercation years before, a bar fight that had ended in another man's death. Though Alan had avoided prison time by claiming self-defense, the incident had been swept under the rug when he relocated to Clearwater. As Ethan delved further, he discovered that Tommy had been a troubled child, often getting into fights and acting out. The school had documented several incidents, and there were reports of bullying, most notably against Emma. But these reports had been conveniently ignored by the authorities, who were more interested in protecting the reputation of the Reynolds family. The more Ethan uncovered, the more it became clear that Tommy's death was no random act of violence. It was tied to something deeper, something the town was trying desperately to keep buried. Ethan's investigation brought him face to face with some of Clearwater's most powerful figures, people who had everything to lose if the truth came out. He received warnings to back off, anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night, even veiled threats in person. But Ethan was determined. He wasn't just fighting for Emma anymore, he was fighting for justice. The turning point came when Ethan discovered a connection between Alan Reynolds and Sheriff Mike Grady, the man who had been so eager to close the case against Emma. The sheriff had been involved in covering up the bar fight years ago, helping Alan escape legal consequences. In return, Alan had been funneling money to the sheriff over the years, keeping him on the payroll. With this new information, Ethan knew he had enough to blow the case wide open. But going public would be dangerous. The people he was up against were ruthless, willing to do anything to protect themselves. And as Ethan gathered the final pieces of evidence, he realized just how high the stakes really were. Because the truth wasn't just about a murder, it was about corruption, power, and a town's willingness to sacrifice an innocent child to protect its own. Chapter 5. The Unraveling. Ethan's heart pounded as he pieced together the final threads of the conspiracy that had ensnared Emma Collins. The stakes had never been higher. He was about to confront the town's most powerful figures with evidence that could destroy them. But he also knew that bringing this evidence to light could put him in grave danger. As he prepared to make his move, Ethan contacted a trusted journalist from Jackson, someone outside of Clearwater's influence. He needed someone who could report the truth without fear of local retaliation. Together, they devised a plan to release the information to the public in a way that would ensure maximum impact. Ethan's next step was to meet with Sheriff Mike Grady. He knew the sheriff was at the heart of the cover-up, and he needed to force him into a corner. They met in a secluded spot on the outskirts of town, away from prying eyes. Grady arrived with a cold, steely look in his eyes, his hand resting ominously on the butt of his gun. "What do you want, Michaels?" Grady growled, his voice laced with menace. Ethan didn't flinch. "I know about your deal with Alan Reynolds. I know you helped him cover up a murder years ago, and I know you've been taking money from him ever since." Grady's eyes narrowed, but he didn't deny it. "You're playing a dangerous game, lawyer. You've got no proof." Ethan pulled out a file and tossed it on the hood of Grady's car. "This is a copy of everything I've found: bank records, court documents, witness statements. The originals are in a safe place, and if anything happens to me, they'll be sent to the press." Grady's face twisted with rage, but there was fear in his eyes too. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice tight. "I want the truth," Ethan said. "Tommy Reynolds wasn't killed by Emma. You know that as well as I do. I want you to admit what really happened. Who's covering for whom?" Grady's jaw clenched, and for a moment, Ethan thought he might pull his gun. But then, the sheriff's shoulders slumped, and the fight seemed to drain out of him. "You don't understand what you're asking," Grady muttered. "There's more at stake here than you know." Ethan leaned forward, his voice low and urgent. "Then help me understand. Tell me what really happened." For a long moment, Grady was silent, staring at the file as if it held the weight of the world. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tommy wasn't supposed to die," he said. "He was supposed to scare Emma, rough her up a little. It was all a stupid plan to teach her parents a lesson." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. "A lesson? For what?" Grady shook his head. The Collinses were getting too close to something they shouldn't have. They were looking into some of Alan's business dealings, stuff that could have blown the whole operation wide open. Tommy was supposed to send a message, but things got out of hand. He hit her too hard, and when she fought back, he lost control. Ethan's mind raced as he processed the sheriff's words. "So, it was all about money? Power?" Grady nodded. "Alan's been laundering money through his business for years, with half the town in on it. The Collinses were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And when Tommy died, we had to pin it on someone. Emma was the easiest target." The revelation hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. The murder, the trial, the town's hostility, it had all been part of a larger scheme, a desperate attempt to protect a web of corruption that ran deep through Clearwater. Ethan knew what he had to do. "You're going to confess, Grady." You're going to tell the court what really happened, and you're going to bring Alan Reynolds down with you." Grady's face hardened again, but he nodded. "I don't have much of a choice, do I?" "No," Ethan said. "You don't." As Ethan turned to leave, he felt a sense of grim satisfaction. The truth was finally coming to light, and the people responsible would pay for their crimes. But as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was far from over. The people he was up against were powerful and dangerous, and they wouldn't go down without a fight. Chapter 6. The Final Reckoning. The courtroom was packed once again, but this time, the atmosphere was different. The air was thick with tension as Ethan prepared to reveal the truth about Tommy Reynolds' death. Sheriff Grady had agreed to testify, and the journalist from Jackson was ready to break the story wide open as soon as the trial ended. The whole town was about to find out just how deep the corruption ran. Ethan took a deep breath as he stood before the judge and jury. "Your Honor," he began, "new evidence has come to light that completely changes the narrative of this case." The defense calls Sheriff Mike Grady to the stand. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as Grady took his seat, his face pale and drawn. Under oath, he recounted everything: his involvement with Alan Reynolds, the cover-up, the money laundering, and the events that led to Tommy's death. The jury listened in stunned silence as the truth was laid bare. When Grady finished, there was a long, heavy silence. The judge looked shaken, and the jury appeared horrified. Ethan knew that the town would never be the same after this, but it was a necessary reckoning. The prosecution tried to salvage what was left of their case, but it was clear that they had lost. The focus had shifted from Emma to the larger conspiracy, and the jury's verdict was inevitable. When the time came, they found Emma Collins not guilty on all charges. The media frenzy that followed was overwhelming. Reporters swarmed the courthouse, eager to get the full story. The journalist from Jackson published an exposé that detailed the corruption and cover-up, sparking investigations at the state level. Alan Reynolds was arrested, along with several other prominent citizens of Clearwater. The town's dark secrets were finally dragged into the light, and the people responsible were held accountable. For the Collins family, the victory was bittersweet. They had been vindicated, but the scars of the ordeal would take years to heal. Sarah and David decided to leave Clearwater, hoping to find peace in a new town where they could start over. Emma, though shaken by everything she had been through, showed remarkable resilience. She was determined to move on with her life, leaving the nightmares of the past behind. As for Ethan, he knew that his work in Clearwater was done. He had fought for justice and won, but the experience had taken its toll. He decided to take a break from law, at least for a while, to clear his head and figure out what came next. But as he packed up his office, he couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. He had done what was right, even when it seemed impossible. And in the end, that was all that mattered. As he drove out of Clearwater for the last time, Ethan looked back at the town in his rearview mirror. It was a place of secrets and lies, but also of redemption and truth. He knew that, despite everything, he would never forget the innocent child who had changed his life forever. The end. The Silent River. Chapter 1. The River's Secret. The river ran silent, a ribbon of darkness winding through the heart of the town. At dawn, the mist clung to its surface, making it seem like the river was holding its breath, concealing something just below the surface. The locals called it O Rio Silencioso, the Silent River. To them, it was more than just a body of water. It was a boundary, a dividing line between the past and present, between what was seen and what was hidden. Detective Jack Malone stood on the edge of the riverbank, his eyes tracing the flow of the water as it meandered through the early morning fog. It was cold, the kind of chill that seeped into your bones and stayed there. He pulled his coat tighter around him, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in his gut. He had been called to the scene just before sunrise, a scene that was becoming all too familiar in this town. A body had been found. The call had come from a local fisherman who'd stumbled upon the lifeless form tangled in the reeds near the shore. The man's voice had trembled as he described the scene, and now, standing before it, Malone understood why. The body was that of a young woman, her skin pale and waxy under the dim light of dawn. Her hair, once a vibrant shade of red, now floated like a dark halo around her head, mingling with the water. Malone crouched down beside her, studying her face. There was something hauntingly familiar about her, but he couldn't quite place it. He turned to the medical examiner, who was already kneeling beside the body, examining the details with a practiced eye. "Any ID on her?" Malone asked, his voice low, barely above a whisper. The medical examiner shook his head. "Nothing on her. No wallet, no phone, no personal effects. Just this." He held up a small silver locket, its chain tangled in the woman's hair. Malone reached out and took it, carefully untangling it from the strands. The locket was old, tarnished with age, and when he opened it, he found a photograph inside. It was faded, but the image was clear enough. A young girl, smiling, with her arms around someone who looked a lot like the woman lying before him. "Could be her daughter," Malone muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "Or maybe her younger self?" The medical examiner nodded. "Could be. But there's something else you need to see." Malone stood and followed him to the other side of the body. The examiner pointed to the woman's wrists. They were bruised, the skin discolored in shades of purple and blue, as if she had struggled against something or someone before she died. "She was bound," the examiner said, "and by the look of it, she put up a fight." Malone's jaw tightened. "Cause of death? Too early to tell, but my guess is drowning. We'll know more once we get her back to the lab." Malone nodded, his mind already spinning with possibilities. The silent river had claimed more than its fair share of lives over the years, but something about this one felt different. This wasn't an accident. It was murder. As the forensics team began their work, Malone turned his gaze back to the river. It was a place of secrets, a place where the past never stayed buried for long. He had seen it time and time again in this town, people trying to outrun their history, only to be dragged back by it, just like the current of the river. He slipped the locket into his coat pocket and walked back to his car. He needed to know who this woman was, and more importantly, who wanted her dead. But as he drove away from the river, that familiar gnawing feeling in his gut didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger. This wasn't just another case. It was the beginning of something much darker, something that had been festering beneath the surface for years. And Jack Malone was about to dive headfirst into it. Chapter 2. Echoes from the Past. The town of Riverbend was deceptively quiet. Nestled between the forested hills and the silent river, it was a place where people came to escape the chaos of the world. The streets were lined with old Victorian houses, their paint chipped and faded, yet still clinging to the elegance of a bygone era. It was a town where everyone knew everyone, and secrets were hard to keep, or so it seemed. Jack Malone knew better. He had grown up in towns like this, where the facade of tranquility hid the dark undercurrents that ran through every community. Riverbend was no different, and the discovery of the woman's body only confirmed what he had always suspected. The past had a way of catching up with you, no matter how fast you tried to run from it. He parked his car outside the Riverbend Police Department, a squat, unassuming building that looked more like a relic of the 1950s than a functioning law enforcement office. As he entered, the familiar smell of old coffee and paper greeted him. The front desk was manned by Officer Sarah Blake, a young recruit with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. "Morning, detective," she greeted him, glancing up from her paperwork. "You're in early." "Had a call out by the river," Malone replied, handing her the locket. "Need you to run a trace on this. See if we can find out who it belonged to." Blake nodded, taking the locket and examining it briefly before setting it aside. "Any idea who she was?" "Not yet, but I have a feeling she's connected to something bigger." Blake arched an eyebrow. "You mean the rumors about the old case? The one everyone says the river swallowed up?" Malone's expression darkened. The case she was referring to was one of Riverbend's most notorious cold cases, a mystery that had haunted the town for over 20 years. A young girl had gone missing, her body never found, and the investigation had hit a dead end. The river was the last place anyone had seen her, and it had kept its secrets well. It crossed my mind, Malone admitted, but I need more to go on before I can make that connection. Blake nodded, sensing the gravity of the situation. I'll get on it right away. Malone left the front desk and headed to his office, a small room cluttered with case files, old newspapers, and a corkboard covered in photographs and notes. It was a chaotic mess, but it was how he worked best, piecing together fragments of information until a clearer picture emerged. He sat down at his desk and opened his laptop, pulling up the old case files. The missing girl's name was Emily Harper. She had been 14 years old when she disappeared, a bright, outgoing teenager with her whole life ahead of her. The last person to see her alive had been her best friend, who said Emily was heading to the river that day, but she never returned. The case had consumed the town for months, with search parties scouring the riverbanks and surrounding woods. But in the end, nothing had been found, and the case had faded into the background, becoming just another tragic story that people whispered about but never fully confronted. Until now. Malone leaned back in his chair, staring at the photographs of Emily Harper. There was a resemblance between her and the woman found in the river this morning. A resemblance that was too strong to ignore. He felt the pieces of the puzzle starting to shift, aligning in ways that hinted at a larger truth, one that had been buried for too long. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. Officer Blake stepped in, holding a file. "Got something for you," she said, handing it to him. The locket belonged to a woman named Rachel Hartman. She moved to Riverbend about a year ago. No known relatives in the area, but there's something else. She was looking into the old case. Apparently, she thought she had a lead on what happened to Emily Harper. Malone's heart skipped a beat. Did she find anything? Blake shook her head. I don't know, but it looks like whatever she found, it got her killed. Malone took the file, his mind racing. Rachel Hartman wasn't just a random victim. She was someone who had been digging into the town's darkest secret. And now, she was dead because of it. As he opened the file and began to read, he knew that this case was about to take him into dangerous territory. The silent river had kept its secret for 20 years, but now it was starting to give them up. And Jack Malone was determined to uncover every last one of them. Chapter 3. The Widow's Warning. Malone couldn't shake the feeling that Rachel Hartman's death was just the tip of the iceberg. The connection to Emily Harper's case was too strong to ignore, and the fact that Rachel had been digging into it only deepened the mystery. There was a story here, one that someone didn't want to be told. The first place to start was Rachel Hartman's house. If she had been investigating the old case, there might be something there. A journal, notes, anything that could provide a clue as to what she had uncovered. Malone grabbed his coat and headed out the door, his mind already racing with questions. Rachel's house was a modest, single-story home on the outskirts of town, nestled between the trees and the river. The place had an air of neglect, as if it had been left to fend for itself for too long. The grass was overgrown, and the paint on the shutters was peeling. Malone pulled into the driveway and stepped out of the car, feeling the weight of the moment as he approached the front door. He knocked, half expecting no one to answer. But to his surprise, the door creaked open, and a woman in her 60s stood in the doorway. She was thin, with sharp features and a wary look in her eyes. Malone recognized her immediately, Martha Hartman, Rachel's mother. She had moved in with her daughter shortly after Rachel arrived in Riverbend, and she was known around town as a reclusive figure, rarely seen outside the house. "Detective Malone," she said, her voice tinged with suspicion. "What are you doing here?" "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Hartman," Malone began, choosing his words carefully. "I'm trying to find out what happened to your daughter. I was hoping you might be able to help me." Martha's expression hardened, and for a moment, Malone thought she might slam the door in his face. But instead, she stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter. The inside of the house was as neglected as the outside. The furniture was old and worn, and a thick layer of dust covered most surfaces. The air was heavy, carrying the scent of stale tobacco and something else, something sour and unpleasant. Malone followed Martha into the living room, where she motioned for him to sit. "I don't know what you're hoping to find, Detective," Martha said, taking a seat across from him. "But I can tell you this much. Rachel was obsessed with that girl's disappearance. She thought she could solve it, bring some kind of closure. But all it brought her was trouble." "What kind of trouble?" Malone asked, leaning forward. Martha's eyes narrowed. "The kind that comes when you dig too deep into things that are best left buried. Rachel started getting phone calls, threats. She didn't tell me much, but I could see it was getting to her. She was scared, but she wouldn't stop. Said she was too close to the truth to back down." Malone felt a chill run down his spine. "Did she ever say who was threatening her?" Martha shook her head. "No, but she was convinced that someone in this town knew what happened to that girl. She talked about old secrets, things that had been covered up. But the more she dug, the more paranoid she became. She started locking herself in her room, staying up all night, scribbling in that journal of hers." "A journal?" Malone's interest piqued. "Do you know where it is?" Martha hesitated, her eyes flickering toward the hallway that led to the bedrooms. "She kept it in her room. But I haven't been in there since they found her." Malone stood up. "Do you mind if I take a look?" Martha didn't respond, but she didn't stop him either. Instead, she remained seated, staring at the floor as Malone made his way down the hallway. He could feel the tension in the air, the weight of unspoken fears and unacknowledged truths pressing down on him as he approached Rachel's bedroom. The door was closed, and when he opened it, he was met with the sight of a room frozen in time. The bed was unmade, the covers twisted and thrown aside, as if Rachel had left in a hurry. The walls were covered with photographs and newspaper clippings, all related to Emily Harper's disappearance. It was a shrine to the unsolved case, a testament to Rachel's obsession. On the nightstand, he found the journal. It was a thick, leather-bound book, its pages filled with Rachel's handwriting. Malone flipped through it, scanning the entries. They were disjointed, frantic, as if Rachel had been writing in a fevered state. But as he read, a pattern began to emerge. Rachel had uncovered something big. She had discovered that Emily Harper wasn't just a random victim. She was connected to a powerful figure in the town. Someone with enough influence to bury the truth for decades. Malone's pulse quickened as he read the final entries. Rachel had been on the verge of exposing everything when she was silenced. He closed the journal, feeling a surge of anger and determination. Whoever was behind this had gone to great lengths to keep their secrets hidden. But they had underestimated Rachel Hartman, and now they were underestimating him. As he turned to leave the room, he caught a glimpse of movement outside the window. He froze, his eyes narrowing as he peered through the curtain. A figure was standing across the street, partially obscured by the shadows. Malone's heart skipped a beat as he realized the figure was watching him. He moved quickly, rushing out of the room and down the hallway. By the time he reached the front door and stepped outside, the figure was gone, leaving nothing but the lingering sense of unease in its wake. Someone knew he was getting close, and they were watching his every move. Chapter 4. The Pastor's Confession. Malone spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing Rachel Hartman's journal, trying to piece together the fragments of information she had left behind. The entries were chaotic, filled with references to people and events that seemed insignificant at first glance, but the more he read, the more he realized there was a thread connecting them all. The key was finding out who in Riverbend had something to hide. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the town, Malone made his way to the local church. The Reverend Samuel Price had been a fixture in Riverbend for as long as anyone could remember, a man known for his quiet demeanor and unwavering faith. But Rachel's journal had mentioned him several times, hinting at a connection between the Reverend and Emily Harper that had never been fully explored. The church was empty when Malone arrived, the heavy wooden doors creaking as he pushed them open. Inside, the air was cool and still, the only sound the faint echo of his footsteps on the stone floor. The stained glass windows cast muted colors across the pews, creating an eerie atmosphere that made the hairs on the back of Malone's neck stand on end. He found Reverend Price in his office at the back of the church, seated at a desk cluttered with books and papers. The old man looked up as Malone entered, his eyes weary but sharp. "Detective Malone," the Reverend greeted him with a nod. "What brings you here at this hour?" "I need to ask you a few questions, Reverend," Malone said, closing the door behind him. "It's about Emily Harper." A shadow passed over the Reverend's face at the mention of her name. He folded his hands on the desk and sighed heavily. "It's been a long time since anyone asked me about that poor girl." Rachel Hartman was asking, Malone said, watching the Reverend's reaction closely. "She believed you knew something about Emily's disappearance. Something that you never told the police." Reverend Price's eyes flickered with a mix of emotions, guilt, sorrow, and something else that Malone couldn't quite place. The old man leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the cross on the wall. "There are things, Detective," the Reverend began, his voice barely above a whisper, "things that are better left unsaid. Emily, she was a good girl, but she got caught up in something she didn't understand." "Like what?" Malone pressed, his tone firm. The Reverend hesitated, his fingers drumming nervously on the desk. "It wasn't just one person, you see. It was a group, a powerful group. They called themselves the Circle of Silence. They were influential men in the town, men with money and power. They had secrets, and they would do anything to keep them hidden." Malone's pulse quickened. "And Emily found out one of those secrets?" Reverend Price nodded slowly. "She came to me terrified. She said she had seen something she wasn't supposed to see. She didn't tell me what it was, but she was scared for her life. I tried to help her, I really did, but..." He trailed off, his voice breaking. Malone leaned forward, his eyes locked on the Reverend's. "But what, Reverend?" The old man's shoulders slumped as if the weight of his guilt had finally become too much to bear. "But it wasn't enough. She disappeared the next day. I knew who was responsible, but I couldn't prove it, and they made sure I stayed quiet. They threatened me, my family." His voice trailed off into silence, the confession hanging heavy in the air. Malone felt a surge of anger mixed with pity for the old man. He had been complicit in a cover-up, whether by choice or by force, and the weight of that decision had clearly taken its toll on him. "Who were they?" Malone asked, his voice tense. "Who's in the Circle of Silence?" Reverend Price shook his head, his eyes filled with fear. "I can't. They'll kill me if I say anything more." Malone stood up, his jaw clenched. "You're already involved, Reverend. They've killed Rachel Hartman because she was getting too close. If you don't help me, more people could die." The Reverend's eyes met Malone's, and for a moment he seemed to be considering it. But then he looked away, his resolve crumbling. "I'm sorry, Detective. I can't. You don't know what they're capable of." Malone sighed in frustration, knowing he wouldn't get any more out of the Reverend tonight. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a card, placing it on the desk. "If you change your mind, you know where to find me," he said, his tone softening. The Reverend nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on the card as if it were a lifeline he was too afraid to grasp. Malone left the church feeling more unsettled than ever. The Circle of Silence, whatever it was, had its roots deep in Riverbend, and it was clear that they would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. But Malone wasn't going to let that happen. He was getting closer, and he knew that the deeper he dug, the more dangerous it would become. But there was no turning back now. Chapter 5. The River's Shadows. The night was dark, the moon obscured by thick clouds that cast Riverbend into an oppressive gloom. Jack Malone stood on the riverbank, his eyes scanning the silent water as it wound its way through the town. The silent river, it had seen everything, held everything, and now it was time for it to give up its secrets. The revelation of the Circle of Silence had changed everything. Malone knew that to unravel the mystery, he would have to confront the powerful forces at play in Riverbend, forces that had controlled the town from the shadows for decades. He had spent the afternoon poring over Rachel Hartman's journal, trying to piece together the fragments of information she had left behind. The names of several prominent men in the town had surfaced: businessmen, politicians, and law enforcement officials, all connected by their involvement in the circle. But one name stood out above the rest: William Calloway. A wealthy real estate developer and one of the most influential men in Riverbend, Calloway had a reputation for getting what he wanted, no matter the cost. Rachel had believed that Calloway was the key to the circle, the man at the center of it all. Malone's next move was clear. He had to confront Calloway, but he knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed someone who could corroborate his findings, someone who had been close to the circle. His thoughts turned to Reverend Price, the old man who had been too afraid to speak out. Malone returned to the church, finding the Reverend in the same place he had left him, seated at his desk, his hands clasped in prayer. When the Reverend looked up and saw Malone standing in the doorway, a look of resignation crossed his face. "Detective," Reverend Price said quietly, "I knew you'd be back." "I don't have time to wait, Reverend," Malone said, stepping into the office. "I'm going after Calloway tonight, but I need you to come with me. You're the only one who can back up what I've found." The Reverend's face paled. "You don't understand, Detective. Calloway, he's dangerous. If you go after him, you're putting yourself in harm's way." "I know," Malone replied, his voice steady. "But if we don't stop him, more people will die. Rachel Hartman, Emily Harper, they won't be the last." The Reverend hesitated, the fear evident in his eyes. But then, slowly he nodded. "All right, Detective. I'll go with you. But I pray we're not too late." William Calloway's estate was a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of Riverbend, surrounded by high walls and guarded by security cameras. As Malone and Reverend Price approached the gate, the weight of what they were about to do settled over them like a shroud. Malone had called for backup, but he knew it might not be enough. Calloway had connections, and if the circle of silence was as powerful as Reverend Price claimed, then they were walking into a lion's den. But Malone was determined to see it through. The time for fear was over. The gate was unlocked, a sign that Calloway was expecting them. They walked up the long driveway, the mansion looming ahead like a dark fortress. As they reached the front door, it swung open, revealing Calloway standing in the entrance, a smug smile on his face. "Detective Malone," Calloway said, his voice smooth and confident. "I've been expecting you." Malone's hand hovered near his gun, but he didn't draw it. "Not yet. You know why I'm here, Calloway? It's over." Calloway chuckled, a low, menacing sound. "Over? Detective, this has been over for a long time. You're too late to change anything." Reverend Price stepped forward, his voice trembling but resolute. "William, I know what you've done. The circle, it has to end." Calloway's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. "You should have stayed out of this, Samuel. Now you've forced my hand." Before Malone could react, two men appeared behind them, flanking the Reverend. They grabbed him, twisting his arms behind his back. Malone reached for his gun, but Calloway held up a hand, stopping him. "Don't be foolish, Detective," Calloway warned. "You're outnumbered and outmatched. You think you can bring me down with your pitiful evidence? The circle is bigger than you can imagine. We control this town. We always have." Malone's mind raced. He had known it would be dangerous, but he hadn't anticipated this. He glanced at Reverend Price, who was struggling against his captors, his eyes pleading with Malone to do something. But Malone knew he couldn't win this fight. Not here, not now. He needed to live to fight another day, to gather more evidence, to bring the full weight of the law down on Calloway and his cronies. For now, he had to retreat. He took a step back, his hand still on his gun. "This isn't over, Calloway. I'll be back. And next time, I'll bring the whole damn town with me." Calloway's smile returned, full of dark amusement. "We'll see about that, Detective." But for now, I suggest you leave before things get ugly." Malone hesitated, his heart pounding with anger and frustration. But he knew he had no choice. He turned and walked away, leaving Reverend Price behind. As he reached the gate, he heard Calloway's voice echoing through the night. "Goodbye, detective, and good luck." Chapter 6. The Last Dive. Malone drove back to the station, his mind racing with the events of the night. Calloway was more dangerous than he had imagined, and the Circle of Silence was a force that wouldn't go down easily. He had lost this battle, but the war was far from over. As he parked outside the station, his phone buzzed. It was a text message from Officer Blake. "We found something. You need to see this." Malone's heart skipped a beat. He hurried inside, finding Blake waiting for him in the evidence room. She looked shaken, her usual composure rattled. "What is it?" Malone asked, his voice tight with anticipation. Blake handed him a file. "We ran another check on Rachel Hartman's phone records. There were calls she made to a number we couldn't trace before. But we finally cracked it. The number belongs to a property out by the old mill, near the river." Malone's pulse quickened. "What did you find?" Blake hesitated, her eyes filled with unease. "We sent a team out there to investigate. They found something buried near the riverbank. The car, detective. It's been submerged for years." Malone's blood ran cold. "Emily Harper's car?" Blake nodded. "It matches the description. And there was a body inside." Malone felt a wave of nausea wash over him. After all these years, they had finally found Emily Harper. But the discovery only deepened the mystery. Why had her car been buried out there? And why had it taken so long to find? "I need to see it," Malone said, his voice steely. Blake nodded, leading him to the evidence locker. Inside, they had placed the items recovered from the car. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and Malone steeled himself as he approached the evidence table. There, among the waterlogged debris, was a notebook. It was old, the pages stained and brittle, but it was still legible. Malone carefully opened it, his eyes scanning the handwritten entries. It was Emily Harper's diary, filled with the thoughts and fears of a teenage girl who had seen too much. The final entry sent a chill down Malone's spine. "They're after me. They know I saw them. The circle won't let me live, but I can't run. They'll find me no matter where I go. I'm leaving this here, in case someone finds it. Please, tell my story. Tell the world what they did." Malone closed the diary, his hands trembling. Emily had known she was going to die, and she had left this as a final plea for justice. He felt a surge of determination, stronger than ever before. The Circle of Silence had taken everything from Emily Harper. They had silenced her, buried her, and moved on with their lives. But they had made one mistake. They had underestimated Jack Malone. He wouldn't rest until he brought them all down. William Calloway, the Reverend, every last one of them who had a hand in this, he would expose their crimes, no matter the cost. As he left the station, the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, casting a pale glow across the town. The silent river flowed beside him, carrying the weight of the town's secrets. But now, those secrets were beginning to surface. Malone knew the battle ahead would be dangerous, but he was ready. Emily Harper's story would be told. Rachel Hartman's work wouldn't be in vain. The Circle of Silence was about to face the one thing they feared most, the truth. And Jack Malone would make sure it was heard. The end.
If you enjoyed our story, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications.